Welcome to this interview with Professor David Grusky, which is Professor of Sociology at Stanford University. He's the director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. He recently published a book about inequality in the 21st century, and is the author of many very important books in sociology. So today we're going to be asking him some questions about his work and his future work in sociology in general.
Yes, so my first question to Professor Grusky is, so Giacomo briefly mentioned about your major work, but could you say a little bit more about your major work?
Absolutely, happy to do so. Pleasure to be here. Of late, a lot of my work has focused on what might be termed infrastructural projects, in the sense that it's not featuring my own research, but trying to build in particular data sets that will allow for a wider range of work on the part of scholars throughout the discipline and beyond. So there are three main infrastructural projects in which I've been interested. One is to build linked administrative data that allow for a larger N analysis of basic demographic and inequality processes. So that's one big infrastructural project. There's also an infrastructural project trying to build out a supplementary form of qualitative analysis that relies on large N samples that are representative and that allow for secondary analysis. And then a third infrastructural project is to build out cell phone data sets that allow us to better understand network processes.
Thank you. Thank you. And my second question is, so in your Marx paper lecture yesterday, you told us a lot about open science in sociology. So how do you see open science principles in sociology in the next 20 years?
It's a great question, and in many ways I think open science is simply a formalization of commitments that we've long held but have not been realized very successfully in the context of quantitative research, in the context of qualitative research, in the context of network research, or experimental research across all these various traditions. There's a vast gap between how science is supposed to happen and what in practice is really happening. And so I think those sorts of disjunctures between the stories we tell about what should be happening and what's concretely happening in the world of science sometimes are exposed, called into question, and one would hope rectified. So I think there's a future for open science because it holds us to those commitments that most of us think are the essence of science, and says, yeah, we should actually do what we say we're doing. So I think I'm hopeful that in fact it'll bear real fruit in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Okay, so it sounds like sociology as a discipline is moving toward open science slowly but steadily. And my another question is, so we are moving toward these open science principles, but what type of institutions or discipline level support are needed for open science?
Yeah, well, what I talked about yesterday, what I think is deeply problematic, is that open science costs money. In order to realize our commitments, you have to be willing to dedicate the resources that are needed to realize those commitments. And there's been a lot of money plowed into the quantitative sector to build these public use data sets that allow for secondary analysis that make it possible to realize at least some open science commitments, although we're far from where we ought to be. But there has not been a comparable investment within the qualitative zone, even though it's been one of the most influential and productive zones within sociology and the social sciences. And so it certainly is deserving of the support in terms of resources that have been lavished upon the quantitative world. And if we were to deliver that type of support as we do within the quantitative sector, I think it would be an immensely productive investment and would allow qualitative research to live up to the open science commitments that we hold dear.
Okay, so more people are talking about this open science in sociology. In your experience, what would be the main challenges of open science in sociology?
One of the main challenges is, as I said already, that we need to commit resources to be able to realize a true open science. But another fundamental problem is that there are all sorts of power dynamics in play, all sorts of self-interest dynamics in play that aren't necessarily aligned with the collective good and the advancement of science. That there are ways to get ahead in one's own career that are perhaps in one's self-interest, but don't necessarily generate the collective good and advanced science. And so I think that's always the kind of the big tension, is trying to bring into alignment what furthers one's own interest and furthers the collective good. And so that's a tension that also has to be addressed. That's a hard problem to solve, but the resources problem is something that's within our reach and is perhaps where we can make real headway.
I'd like to ask you a few questions about inequality research, and maybe I could start with a general question about poverty, inequality, and mobility. Could you talk a little bit about how these three phenomena interact and influence each other, and what are their main differences?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can think of mobility as the process by which inequalities in generation one are reproduced in generation two. And so there are opportunities because of that to intervene in the mobility process in ways that would then reduce inequality in generation two. So that's one very attractive way of proceeding. But there's also ways in which you can say, well, it is so, the sort of the processes of mobility are so institutionally entrenched, there are so many opposing interests that make it difficult to intervene in the process of reproduction, that instead you can directly intervene in the inequality in generation two, rather than doing so indirectly through the mobility process. So you always have this tension, this decision of whether or not you're going to try to take on the institutional processes of reproduction, or say that they're so entrenched, so difficult to take on, that instead we should just cut to the chase and intervene directly in the inequality that obtains in generation two. That's kind of one of the fundamental questions of our time, is how to get the job done, and that's the big divide.
So perhaps could you tell us a little bit more about these institutions, and which institution have you identified as being the main drivers of inequality, reproduction of inequality over generations?
I guess I would turn the question around. It's harder to identify those institutions that aren't implicated. The production of inequality is so embedded in every institution of our society that one would be hard pressed to find one that doesn't. But nonetheless, I'll take on the task. And maybe one way to think about it is in a life course formulation. That is, at the point of conception, you're going to have all sorts of inequality transferred to the newly conceived child by virtue of environmental exposures that can be problematic if you don't have the money to avoid those exposures. Then at the point of birth, you're going to have differential access to early childhood training. To get high quality training, you need to have money. If you don't have money, you're not going to, as a child, get access to the kind of training that we know has payoff. The neighborhood is a kind of ambient source of resources of all sorts, including networks, but much more, quality of schooling, quality of public goods. And so in order to get access to the kinds of resources that we know how to pay off, it takes, again, alas, money. So you have to buy opportunity for your child. If you don't have the money to buy opportunity for your child is going to be compromised down the line. So now we're maybe up into the college zone. Again, in many countries, most countries, certainly my country, we've decided to put college on the market. Like we put everything on the market. And so, alas, again, if you want to provide opportunity for your child, you're going to have to put money on the table and buy that opportunity for the child in the form of having access to high quality tertiary training. Okay, so now you're out of college, and again, there are all sorts of processes that are embedded within the workplace that privilege those who have made prior investments. So there's discrimination on the basis of class, there's discrimination on the basis of gender, there's discrimination on the basis of race. All of these processes, of course, were implicated in these earlier institutions as well, but within the workplace, you have discrimination as well on the basis of all of these processes. That's going to further generate inequality. I'll stop there. But it would be harder to name institutions that aren't involved. I missed already many fundamental institutions. Incarceration is obviously a fundamental institution that's generating lots of inequality, in particular racial inequality. Neighborhoods are segregated. They also generate inequality in ways beyond what I've already discussed. It is stitched into every institution of our society, and that's what makes it so difficult, of course, to take on the institutional solutions that we need.
So, to follow up on that, I'm wondering if you can maybe, because we're in Europe here and your work is focused on the US context, what have we learned about comparing and studying different inequality regimes? I'm thinking about countries like perhaps Sweden, perhaps countries like France, and compared to the US, can we say that more equal countries are really more mobile, for instance, or is there other lessons that you have made by these comparisons of inequality regimes?
Yeah. So I think one dimension on which real fundamental differences are in play are the extent to which we have put opportunity on the market and said it's for sale. Now, all countries do that. It always takes money to buy opportunity for your children, but in some countries we've come into the putting opportunity on the market in a kind of full-throated fashion. And I would think to say the US is a country that's really committed, that's all in to the idea that everything should go on the market, everything, even opportunity. And that is arguably a violation of our most sacred principle that we say we believe in, namely that all children, no matter how well off their parents may be, no matter what the race of their parents, no matter what the neighborhood in which they're born, all children should have opportunity to get ahead. But instead what we've said is, well, you need to buy it. We put it on the market. We put everything on the market in the US, and that makes it immensely difficult for us to realize this commitment to equal opportunity. Other countries have more public goods, and hence you don't need to buy opportunity. It's just seen as a birthright. All children should have it, and so that's a meaningful difference. So again, there are two ways to go. You can take opportunity out of the market and deliver it directly, or you can say, okay, we're going to put everything on the market, but if you go down that road, then you need to equalize the income distribution so that all families can have access to the opportunity that takes money to purchase for your kids.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. Perhaps I just wanted to ask you this sort of perennial question about poverty and inequality. What would you say to people who argue that we should focus most of our effort on poverty and perhaps later on inequality? What is it about inequality that it makes it, a topic of so much intellectual and economic investment compared to absolute poverty or relative poverty?
Well, I think the reason why we care so much about poverty is that there's just profound deprivation in many of even the richest societies that so compromises people's life chances. And so, of course, you want to rectify those profound forms of deprivation. But we also know that relative deprivation at the higher levels of the income distribution can compromise people's life chances as well. So obviously that's a high priority to take on, in addition to the more profound types of deprivation at the bottom of the income distribution. I don't have much to add beyond that. We care about both. We care about both deeply, but of course one would prioritize the deprivation that obtains at the very bottom of the income distribution.
So in one of your recent projects, you explore interaction segregation. Could you say a little bit more about how you got interested in interaction segregation?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do so. I talked earlier about how inequality is embedded in all of our institutions, and one way in which that manifests itself is that at kind of the most basic level, our probability of meeting people who are similar or different from us in terms of economic status is very much affected by your starting point and how much money you have. So that kind of everyday life in which you run into people of similar or different economic statuses is very hard to monitor. We know in kind of a static way how people who are well off live in particular neighborhoods and people who have less money live in different neighborhoods, but we don't know how that translates into your everyday experiences of meeting people who are similar or different from you. So the objective was to see what the everyday life of people of different economic statuses looks like, and who they're meeting and who they're interacting with.
So in that project, you used a very novel data. Could you say a little bit more about how you measure interaction in daily lives?
Yeah, well, it turns out that it's possible to see how people move through the city through the cell phones that many people carry with them as they move through the city. And so that's one kind of passive way in which you can track the effects of these different institutional sources of inequality. We just see who's meeting whom by virtue of the location devices that they carry passively in their pockets.
Perhaps to follow up on that, I find your research on the idea of commercial segregation really fascinating. Can you tell us just a bit more about that?
Yeah, so what we sought to undertake was to examine this long-standing hypothesis that big cities are zones of economic intermixing. So the argument is that by virtue of being in a dense environment, there's going to be a lot of mixing of people of different economic statuses, and cities are zones where this mixing happens. What we found to the contrary was that, in fact, big cities have the scale to make it possible to devise venues that are targeted to very thin socioeconomic slices of the population. So you can have a restaurant for rich people, a restaurant for middle-income people, a restaurant for poor people. And in a big city, you can have those specialized restaurants that are specialized to particular socioeconomic slices of the population. And that then has the effect of undermining the intermixing that you might not otherwise would have happened. So people who are rich go to the restaurants for rich people who are middle income go to the middle income restaurant, People who are poor go to restaurants for people with less income. In a small city, by contrast, you don't have the scale that makes it possible to target venues precisely to one's economic circumstances, and then you might have, for example, a single diner in a small city, and everyone hangs out there, and that becomes an opportunity for intermixing. So this is a type of dynamic, and a kind of an unanticipated dynamic that undermines opportunity for intermixing in large cities. There are, however, some cities we find that, although they could target in this way to thin slices of the economic distribution, in fact, they locate venues, like, say, shopping centers, between neighborhoods that are diverse in economic status, and they then become places where the intermixing does happen. So these locational decisions, where, say, shopping centers are found within the city, can have implications for how much intermixing happens. Which means that, of course, we should commit principally and primarily to desegregating our neighborhoods, but a secondary strategy that might be undertaken is to think about how say, very important zones of interaction like shopping centers are placed between neighborhoods of diverse economic statuses, and then become zones in which contact between people of different economic status can happen and thrive and be fostered.
Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about what have been the ideas or some of the policies behind desegregation, neighborhood desegregation. What are the possibilities, and what have been the proposal to do something like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the more promising lines is to eliminate exclusionary policies that are propagated, say, through zoning and other sorts of regulatory processes that make it difficult to provide housing of different levels within the same community. We should commit, I would think, to all living together. Of course, first and foremost, we should commit to reducing inequality. Secondarily, if you're going to have some inequality, and of course you're going to have at least some, you want, I would think, to have neighborhoods in which people of different economic status can live together, and then everyone can have access to the amenities that a neighborhood provides, rather than just having a situation in which the highest quality amenities are only available to people who are well off. And then you have other neighborhoods that are mainly the province of lower income folks, and they have less amenities. That's certainly not something we want. It compromises our commitment to equal opportunity, and hence we should try to have intermixing within neighborhoods, thereby equalize access to amenities. So to get that to happen, you need to have zoning and regulatory processes that encourage mixed income developments within neighborhoods. It's completely within our capacity to do that. That's a human decision, a social decision to not do that, and we should change that. We should make sure that we have zoning and other regulations that allow for a mix of housing across the economic levels.
So, what are the forces behind this resistance in your experience? I'm sure you had many experience with official or in the government, and who would you say are the main hurdles into getting government to take action on segregation or even inequalities?
Well, I think the main problem is we have a democratic system in which the voices of everyone are not equally heard. Just like opportunity can be purchased, influence can also be purchased. And those who have lots of money have more access to decision makers who influence the policies that govern, say, for example, whether or not neighborhoods are or are not segregated. So it's a governance problem. It's a problem of voice. It's a problem that voice can be purchased, and that those who have money, of course, like the status quo. They like a system that's set up to privilege their children. And so they have more power and more influence, and that's the fundamental problem, right? The fundamental problem that makes it difficult for change to happen.
So, interesting because obviously it's very difficult to do something about this big question. So here my question would be, if we cannot change these big things, what is typically voting, the structural voting, things like that, what do you think are the most promising possible policies within a very narrow context of high inequalities and everything you mentioned? Is there something that comes into your mind that you think that it is feasible within that context that would actually be possible and highly beneficial to reduce inequality in the long term?
I guess I don't like that formulation. Because if we acquiesce and say that the big changes that we need are off the table and impossible, then of course they are off the table and they will be impossible. And so we should say they're not impossible. We built this world. It's a mess, but we can also rebuild it. And it's going to take big things to change the world in the way that it needs to be changed. And we shouldn't say that's off the table. We should overpromise with respect to the capacity of very small interventions to deliver. They're not going to deliver. We have big problems. We need big interventions. And we should own up to that and not settle. I think we should consider to go for the gold and make the big changes that we need to make.
Thank you. Okay, that's very interesting. I would like to also ask you, here we are in Europe, in the European context, and obviously from what we hear from America, a lot of things are going wrong in America, but I was wondering if you could perhaps tell us one thing that European policymakers could learn from what went right in America. Is there something that you have identified and you think, okay, this is something that is actually working, that perhaps Europe could work? I don't know, maybe I know you have done a lot of very interesting work about occupational closure. It seems to me, perhaps I'm wrong, that in countries like France, occupational closure is much higher than in the US. I don't know if that is true, but that would be my guess. Is there something, perhaps along those lines, that you might think that European countries could learn from America? Big question.
Yeah. It's often said that redistributive approaches, as opposed to predistributive ones, are less structural and less fundamental. Let me be a little bit clearer on that, and I'll get to your question. But there are really two ways you can take on the task of reducing inequality. One is to try to fix the institutions that generate inequality. That would be considered predistributive. So you could imagine, reducing discrimination. You could imagine desegregating neighborhoods. These are all processes that generate inequality. You can change those institutions and reduce inequality by virtue of doing so. Or you could say these things are so entrenched, these institutional forces, that I'm just going to deliver the money. At the end of the day, they can do a lot of reparations, if you will, for the damage that our institutions have generated. That is also a type of structural reform, and so it's a kind of promising approach in the sense that just by delivering more money to people who have historically not had money, that can then propagate over time in the reproduction of advantage in subsequent generations. So it's a structural reform, and I think the United States has delivered some promising approaches in that regard. The Earned Income Tax Credit is a way to reduce inequality at the bottom of the income distribution, and it's been very, very successful. There are other approaches of this sort that are being discussed more prominently in the US, like guaranteed income, like baby bonds. They all focus on redistributive solutions that can be seen as very structural, very powerful, and I think maybe the United States has something to contribute along that line of, along that approach, that's redistributive in its focus rather than predistributive.
I mean, is this what you're saying somewhat linked between the difference between equality of opportunity and equality of condition? And are you perhaps saying that the US is still more focused on trying to equalize these opportunities, equalize these processes, rather than just come after the facts? Perhaps in Europe, inequality is less, but we might be less interested in making societies work like that, but more blankly redistributing after the fact of inequality. Is it something along those lines?
Well, I should be clear that I don't think the US has done a stellar job on any dimension with respect to reducing inequality. Sort of pre-distributive reforms that we need have not been pursued nearly as aggressively as we should, and the sorts of redistributive reforms that we need have not been pursued nearly as aggressively as they should be. So I'm not saying that we've done an adequate job on either dimension, but there have been developments of late within the United States in which redistributive programs have been quite successful, like the Earned Income Tax Credit, and I think there are others on the horizon, like guaranteed income and baby bonds, that could likewise be successful. So I don't want to oversell them. I don't want to say that there's been some extraordinary payoff, but there are promising signs in that front. That's all.
Yes. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you.